Robert Birchard joined Walt Disney Television Animation near the start of that division's creation in the 1980s. He was among the first film editors recruited to mold and shape the new division's half-hour series when they returned from overseas studios. And by the early 90s, Bob was editing close to half of Disney Television Animation's animated output, among them DuckTales, Aladdin, Timon and Pumbaa, Jungle Cubs, and Gargoyles. We spoke in the Animation Guild's conference room. So, Robert, you started doing editorial work in the animation business way back when...
in the olden days.
In the olden days, when Ulysses Grant and Gerald Ford were running a joint presidency. So, how did you get into animation as an editor, and what was the business like in the 1970s?
Well, I might very well have been one of your members if I could draw. I was in the fourth grade about the time we met. And I was enamored of animation, and I enjoyed drawing. I just couldn't do it very well. I, watched John Nagy learn to draw, and I could draw the 5 simple shapes, and I could do a reasonable facsimile of the workbook drawings, but I was no artist. But I still had a love of animation and a love of film, and I grew up being interested in silent films and being interested in the history of the motion picture business. I ended up working for Echo Film Service, which was basically a sound post-production company. I was the office...
In Hollywood, right?
In Hollywood, yeah. We were at General Service Studios at the time. And I was the office manager. I wasn't really working in the editing. I was sort of managing things. And one of the editors who worked for us was a guy named Bill Kowalchuk, and he ended up getting a job at Hanna-Barbera, and I was making $250 a week as the office manager at Echo, and
big money back in 1970.
It was okay money, but it was, I was 28 years old, and I was looking at a rather stagnant career at that point, and Bill called me and said, we need a sound editor over here at Hanna-Barbera. And so I went over to interview, and they were all set to hire me. And then they said, oh, well, there's other people on the list and other people on the roster, so we can't hire you.
The union thing.
Yes. And then a couple of days later, they called and said, well, we tried to get a hold of the people, and they were,
unavailable.
Either unavailable or we couldn't get a hold of them, so they were able to hire me. So I got into the union as a full sound editor.
Right off the get-go.
Right off the get-go.
You didn't have to go up to the stages and all that?
And at the time, I didn't even have an idea what the roster was, the industry roster. Several years later, they caught up with me and said, you've been working and you're not on the roster. And I said, what's the roster?
But they pushed you on the roster because you had your 30 days, right? And they couldn't get around that.
Yeah. So anyway, I started at Hanna-Barbera in the fall of 1978.
What was the studio like in those days?
It was very informal. It was a different world. Not that Bill, Hanna, and Joe Barbera were all that chummy, but they made a point every year of coming down and introducing themselves to all of the editorial department was in the basement. I remember Nick Nichols, one of the directors, this is long before the internet, of course, they were having a conversation upstairs about the lyrics to When You Wish Upon a Star, and he came down to editorial and got a bunch of us together, and we went through the lyrics, to refresh his memory, and we ended up singing the song.
And Nichols had worked at Disney for years and years.
Yeah, I mean, everybody who was at Hanna-Barbera had worked forever. Alex Lovey and Nick Nichols, and of course Bill and Joe.
Don Lusk was over there then.
Yeah. And it was it was I wouldn't call it a family atmosphere, but it was a very cordial and open atmosphere. I mean, Bill and Joe, wanted you to know who they were as much as they wanted to know who we were, because they were open to ideas. Joe Ruby and Ken Spears came up with Scooby-Doo. They were editors in the basement, and so I think Bill and Joe thought, if you keep an open door, you might hit gold.
Did you pitch anything in those days, or were you
No,
just...
I really didn't. I was only there for about 3 months, and it was interesting because I had been around sound editors at Echo. I knew the process, but I had never done it.
What did the job entail?
Well, the shows would come in. We were mostly dealing with 11-minute cartoons that 2 of them would make up a half hour. Although the show I started on was Jana of the Jungle, which, as I recall, was a full half hour or 22-minute show.
2 acts.
2 acts. I knew it had to have sound, and we had music editors who cut the music, so we didn't have to deal with that. Mainly we had to sync up the track. And we also had to, shows would come in a little long. These were all on 35 millimeter film. When I say a little long, for an 11-minute segment, you might be 15, 20 feet over at most. And the philosophy at Hanna-Barbera was, find 3-5 foot scenes that you can cut out and you're done. And I
cut off the slates, and
I was never satisfied with that. Because had gone to film school and I was reading about editing at the time, and they didn't want us wasting a lot of time on this stuff. But at Hanna-Barbera at the time, they had developed the whole assembly line of TV animation, and they had a process.
They pretty much invented it.
Yeah, called normal pause, which basically there were 8 frames before and 8 frames after the action in any scene. And so if a character threw something out of a scene, then there'd be an 8-frame emptiness, and then it would go into the next scene, and there'd be an 8-frame emptiness coming in before the object would come in frame.
So there was a long arc of that object flying through the air.
And I was reading about Max Sennett and about editing and how you keep the action moving by, cutting on, if somebody is leaving a frame, you cut them halfway out, and as somebody's coming into the frame, you cut them halfway in, so you have a smoothness and continuous motion. And I started doing that, cutting out a foot here and a foot there. And
that went over all right?
Well, the first time I became aware of it was a little later, when I was working at Ruby and Spears during the Directors Guild strike in 1980, and Ken and Joe had an interesting policy. They would come down to look at the cartoons, but they would never allow the editor to be in the room after they'd be there with the supervising editor, who was Chip Yaros. And so we'd have to wait outside to see if the thing had been blessed. And I was working on an episode of Dingbat and the Creeps.
One of the classics.
One of the classics, yeah. A lot of these were 13-week wonders. And there was a very similar thing where I was, Dingbat was throwing something, was hitting somebody in the head and was tightening it up. And Ken Spears came out of the cutting room while I was standing there, and I heard him say, "Well, that was a lot better than I remembered it." and it was, it was the same cartoon. It was just
tightened up,
finessed, and we couldn't do a lot of it because you got 1,000 feet of film, maybe 100 cuts. We didn't have 100 extra feet to, but where we could tighten it up and start rearranging scenes. And from Hanna-Barbera, I was fast. This was back in the days, the part that they never...
Moviolas.
Moviolas, but they never tell you this part when the producers are haranguing how union costs are overrun. Back in those days, the networks would pay overtime at cost plus 40. And so at Hanna-Barbera, we were
encouraged to do overtime.
We were encouraged to work 12 hours a day. And usually a minimum of 10. We were practically required to work Saturdays and Sundays. And I never needed that extra time. And
what did you do with it?
Well, I would say, I'm finished with my work, can I go home now? And they'd try to find something else for me, but oftentimes they let me go home. But one time, and this led to the advancement in my career, there was a Popeye show that came in on a, whatever.
This was for Ruby Spears?
No, this was for Hanna-Barbera.
Hanna-Barbera.
And they needed it. It needed to go on the dubbing stage the next day in order to get on the air for Saturday. And so they had jobbed out the sound editing to an outside service. And I was finished with my work, so they said, well, can you go down and help them? I said, sure. So I went down to Angel Editorial, which was on Larchmont.
Yeah.
Right down the street from Bill Melendez.
Right below Paramount Pictures.
Right. And so I went in, and they'd cut up the cartoon into 200-foot sections, and I cut my sound effects for it and said goodbye and went back over the hill to Hanna-Barbera. And the next day, Bob Rutledge, who was the head of Angel Editorial, came down, and he said things went very well, and he asked me if I would want to work on a TV show with them. And I said sure, because I had nothing going. I was looking at unemployment after.
Yeah, you were facing layoff?
Well, the work was very seasonal, and one of the reasons why a lot of the editorial staff liked to work the long overtime is because they basically work 6 months a year, and then we're off 6 months a year.
Right. Well, same as the artistic staff.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's just a different time of year, and we had a guy who we call, I can't remember, Joe Rotano, I guess his name was, and we called him Rat Nose, and he dealt in insurance, and they didn't have phones in every room in those days. There was one phone on the wall, and Joe would be on the phone selling insurance half the day because he would pile in, 60, 70, 80 hours a week to build up that overtime. But what I was starting to say is in those days the networks would pay at cost plus 40 for overtime, so they encouraged as much overtime as possible.
That's right. HB, the more you worked, the more they made.
That's right. And anyway, Bob Rutledge asked me to come and work for him, and I ended up being a sound editor on Dukes of Hazzard.
For live action?
Yeah. And in those days, most TV series were fairly tame, a door open and close, a few footsteps, and, but this was a killer. I mean, it was normally, and again in those days, there would be 5 editors on a 5-reel show. We had 3, and we were working
all the time,
18 hours a day to get that show done, and we'd think, well, it can't possibly keep up this pace.
Car chase. And
we'd come in the next week. I remember one week coming in, I was just exhausted, and the first reel was a full 10-minute reel of car chase with 5 cars, 2 police cars, 2 semi-trucks, all going at the same time, and so it was an ordeal by fire because, as I say, I hadn't been a sound editor before these experiences.
And you were a sound editor on this.
Yeah.
So you weren't having to pick takes and do coverage and all that stuff, or was there some of that involved?
No. I mean, the shows were all cut by the time we got them, but I'd picked up again by hanging around. When I was at Echo, my training ground was Bob Friedman, who had been a former post-production supervisor for Filmways, And my boss had been a post-production supervisor for Filmways as well. And Bob was working at Metro Media at the time and doing his own syndication cut-downs of shows they were distributing. And he would come over to our place because we had cutting rooms. And about 5 o'clock at night, after we'd broken off for the day, and he'd come and cut down his shows. And he'd say, "Come on, Bobby." And I'd go back and watch him work, and we'd talk. And so
see how he trimmed,
right? And I knew film from an artistic point of view, having studied it, and I had big ears and I picked up a lot. I remember one of the things I knew from working around sound editors was that if you're in a car chase and you have a car by and then you cut inside, you don't cut off the car by to go to the steady interior.
You keep the sound going.
You keep the sound going. And so it's smooth. And a number of years later, there was this really hotsy-totsy sound editor who was lording it over everybody because he'd worked for Gordon Ecker.
And this was in Cartoon Land?
No, this was in a live action. It was over here at Sound Effects Inc. And he came back devastated one day because he was cutting a reel of a Man from U.N.C.L.E. movie, and his reel was bounced from the stage, and he had not learned that rule that you keep the buys going, and so his reel sounded very choppy, and so I picked this stuff up. I remember the sound effects were built into fill leader, junk 35 millimeter film. And I remember getting this kind of weird stuff, and I said, "Oh, that's a panel of Cinerama." And I don't know why I knew it, but it was weird, and I looked at it and I figured it out, and I showed it to some of the other sound editors at Echo, and they said, "What's that? We've never seen anything like that."
Squeezed.
So I don't know whether I was precocious or just because I was interested, I picked up all this stuff along the way. Anyway, so I was at Hanna-Barbera for 3 months. I went to do live action sound editing on Dukes of Hazzard.
Dukes of Hazzard, and that lasted about 3 months?
That was another 13 weeks, but we were probably on it for about 20 weeks.
Better part of 6 months.
Yeah. And I worked on Close Encounters Special Edition, and I worked on Thief, and a TV movie called Rodeo Girl. And then I went to work for the Directors Guild cutting documentaries, directors working, and I worked with Chuck Workman on that. And Chuck later went on to win an Academy Award for Precious Images, but I cut Chuck's first award-winning film, which was The Director and the Image in this series that we were doing for the Directors Guild.
Which led you to your next animation job.
Yeah, well, what happened there was Bill Kowalchuk, again, who'd gotten me into Hanna-Barbera, started his own post-production company called CinePost, and he hired me to go there, and we were recutting unreleased features to try and get them so they could be distributed. And I probably shouldn't say this, but it's true. Bill liked to be the executive and sit in his office and pontificate, and I did a lot of the work.
And he took the credit.
Well, we shared the credit, but it was when you're picture doctoring, you can't really. Those credits were like associate post-production supervisor because you can't take the credit for it because you win all kinds of friends and influence all sorts of people negatively when you're taking over their work. And
so you keep one foot.
But similarly, what happened was Bill's sister worked at Deke, and Deke had a policy at the time, one of their few policies, of not having any nepotism. So we applied to do some sound effects editing for them, but they would never hire us because Bill sister
had a
worked.
sister there and act of nepotism.
Again, one day, I don't know whether it was because of speed or quick turnaround, or they were having. I guess ABC had told Deke that if they didn't get their sound together, they were going to cancel The Littles, which was their big series at the time. So they broke ranks and broke tradition, and they hired us to come in and do the sound on The Littles. And I remember going to B&B Sound at 4 a.m. to dub this thing because it had to be finished by 9 o'clock so they could satellite it to the network for Saturday show. And again, we passed muster. And as a result of that, when Deke expanded production, this was in 1984, they had like 5 series. They bought Cinepost, and we became
the post-production
post-production arm at Deke. And although Deke was adamantly anti-union, they set up a separate company called Animation City Editorial Service,
which was union. Had Cinepost been union, or
Cinepost was union? Yeah. So. Bill was interested in maintaining his health benefits because he was married and had a family, and so it was. I mean,
you had the leverage to make it stick with Deke.
Yeah, well, we just wouldn't do it if we didn't get the benefits, and so they felt they needed us, and they caved in. And I tell you, I became the supervising editor for all of Deke's product that year. There were 5 series, and a typical schedule. I think we had 10 editors, 2 for each series. But what would happen is the shows would arrive at the very last minute.
They always came in at the last minute with Deke?
So a typical show would be like Pole Position, which would arrive on Thursday night or Thursday afternoon with 80% black slug.
Now explain the 80% black slug, meaning?
There would be only 20% picture. The rest of it would be slugged out to length with black.
So you didn't have any idea how to sync it up because there was no.
Well, I mean, it was sunk up based on, the animators had been working to the sheets from the tracks we'd put together, but we couldn't see anything to cut sound effects, and this was a car chase show, so we'd get that, and we'd do what we could, and we'd break the cartoon up again into 200-foot sections, and instead of having the 2 people assigned to the show, we'd just hand it out to whoever was handy. Then Friday night, the
picture would come in?
Most of the rest of the picture would come in. I'm not quite right on this. It was Tuesday it would come in. Wednesday it would come in with the rest of the picture. We'd finish cutting everything on Thursday. We'd go to the dubbing stage Friday morning. It would go to the telecine Friday
Now
afternoon.
take us through the steps here. Dubbing stage. You do picture, and then you're cutting in dialogue and music.
Well, the dialogue is pretty much set. We fine sync the dialogue, cutting in the sound effects, cutting in the music, going to. People think, and civilians think, dubbing is adding voices, but dubbing is re-recording in
taking what you already have and running it
and mixing it together into a. And so I would
into a final
supervise
mix.
The editors, and I would supervise the dubbing sessions. We'd dub Friday morning. We would telecine Friday afternoon. Then we'd satellite it to the network Friday night so that they could be on the air Saturday morning.
So you do all this on Friday.
Yeah, and so we had 5 series and 100 and. I think one of them didn't last very long, so there were like 135 total half hours in this period. We were doing The Littles, Get Along Gang, Wolf Rock, and something else. And we had 135 episodes that we churned out in 13 weeks, and we never missed an air date. And this was back in the days when if you missed an air date, you missed your first licensing fee. It was fatal to miss an air date.
Yeah, you missed your... So you're basically... Dubbing is mixing, or you're
yes,
you're mixing all the tracks together, right?
Mm-hmm.
Getting the right levels and the right mix and
blend.
And
that was an education too. Going back to my stint at Hanna-Barbera, and I was no fan of. I was a fan of Warner Brothers and Disney. The TV animation looked pretty gamey to me. But here we were with Jana of the Jungle, and you'd put the music in and the sound effects in, and you'd mix it, and suddenly it was like, wow, this is not bad. I don't know there was any better.
Starting to look like a professional.
It played like a real show, and I became, years later, working, many directors wanted to cut out a lot of music, and I was always one who wanted to fill up that soundtrack because
keeps it alive.
Yeah. And I would cut out music if I had something. There was a Gummy Bears episode where the first minute of the show, they're out at night and there's a sheep herder, and I was able to keep it alive with crickets and sheep baaing, and it was appropriate not to have music. But just a dead cartoon, especially on television, I think
you can't do it.
You can't do it. It's just, others would disagree, and we would, but
politely
I always
discuss. So did the directors come down for these mixes and dubs, and who was down there when you guys were putting the final touches on the masterwork?
Well, it depended. Usually, the sound editor was there for his reel and only his reel. So I would go up from my reel, and then whoever else was working on the show would come up for their reel. When I was supervising the mixes, I'd be there all the time, but that was a little later. I remember at Hanna-Barbera they had this strange system where they would mix the shows, and then they would have this process which they called putting it through the boards. I can't remember the lead mixer's name now, but he had been a prominent sound mixer
for a long time.
And he'd worked on The Waterfront and other things. His second in command was a guy named Bill Getty, who was, rumor had it, Joe Barbera's TV repairman.
Really?
And
got him a better paying gig.
And I remember one day Don Warner, one of the sound editors, he was so pissed off at what Getty had done, he stormed out of the dubbing room and he said, "Bill Getty, you couldn't mix in a bowl." And the other guy would take what had been mixed and he would then finesse it. This was putting it through the boards. And at Hanna-Barbera, it was pretty much verboten to make any comment about what was going on. You had to just sort of bite your tongue and assume it would be fixed by the time it hit the air. But it was an interesting education in seeing just how the image and the music and the sound effects all combine to create a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts.
Yeah.
So anyway, I continued, supervising editing at Deke. I didn't do a lot of cutting, although I did.
Sounds like it was sort of a continuous forced march through Dixie.
Yeah.
Where you were just slam-bamming it along.
And I would often look over the editor's shoulder when he was looking at the reel for the first time and say, cut here, cut here. And I remember once an editor hadn't done something I'd asked, and I said, "Well, where's that shot?" He said, "How do you remember that?" And I said,
It's my job to remember.
It's my job. Yeah, I mean, I literally, when I'm working on something, I remember every shot. Once it's done,
you forget it.
Just erase it, because you clutter your brain with. But because of my experience in live action picture doctoring, I was also into how you could bring some of those skills to animation, because oftentimes, because the shows were animated overseas and the animation was, the Japanese at that time didn't use pegs, so you'd sometimes have a car racing around a mountain, and the mountain overlay wasn't pegged, and so the mountain would be doing this, and you'd have to figure out a way to cut around it and
not have the jumping jittery mountain.
Yeah. So at one point I just got so fed up at Deke. I was exhausted. I was mad at my boss for.
Well, how long was your work week? Because if you had to slam all this stuff together.
Oh, we worked 7 days a week generally. Certainly no fewer than 6, and long hours.
But at least you were getting overtime.
Yeah. But one day I was all set to turn my boss's desk over on him, and I didn't. I bit my tongue, but one of my editors, Charlie King, and I'd heard rumors that he was very good, and I'd heard rumors that he was leaving to go to Disney, and he came up to me one day and said, "Can we go to lunch?" And I said, "Sure." And so we went to lunch. I think it was where we went today.
Bella Vista.
He said, he's sort of hemming and hawing. He says, "Yeah, I know you're going to Disney." And he looked relieved that I wasn't going to bite his head off. And then he said, "Would you like to come too?"
And you said?
And I said, yes, in a minute, And I left what was a 52-week a year job at Deke to take on 13 weeks at Disney. And I wasn't working directly for Disney at that time. They were just setting up Disney TV animation.
Yeah, you were over on
Hollywood Way here, just down the street.
Yeah, I remember that.
908 Hollywood Way.
Subcontracting for.
Yeah. Rich Harrison had a company called The Film Business, and Michael Webster and Tom Rosica had come out of commercials, and Rich had done a lot of work with them. They hired him to handle the editorial.
This is in the very early days.
1985.
Yeah, this is like the first year, probably the first year.
The first year, the first show. I remember sitting with Gary Kreisel when the first pencil test came in for The Adventures of the Gummy Bears, and Gary's primary interest was in the props because he thought they could be spun off into toys. And the pencil test looked great, and then the color came back the next day.
It didn't look quite as impressive.
Quite as impressive. It's one of the things that, we have the greatest background artists in the world here, and they would send them overseas.
And they'd lose something in the translation.
Repaint everything, and it would just never be the same. But one of the ways the business has changed, and this would never happen now, when we went to work on the Disney product, they had promised Rich 2 years contract. Now, there were 2 series, Disney's Adventures of the Gummy Bears and the Wuzzles.
Those are the first two.
Those are the first 2
So
shows.
you were pretty much a Disney TVA
from the very beginning.
From day one.
Yeah. To show you how prescient I am, Rich said, "You can take your choice of what show you want." And I said, "Well, rather do the Wuzzles. And Charlie said, well, I'm going to do that. And, well, okay, so I'll do the Gummy Bears. It doesn't make any difference. Of course, Gummy Bears, Wuzzles lasted 13 weeks, and Gummy Bears lasted 5 years. So.
Yeah, so you rode the rocket because you were not allowed to take your first choice.
So the thing that, with the Disney stuff that was, I think, most interesting for me as an editor was that we were not only cutting the picture.
So you were moving up from sound to sound and picture?
And also cutting the music, which I'd never done before. And we would cut a teaser trailer for the, show to give us a little more footage to cut out of the episode.
Yeah.
And that was fun because you got to do everything, And then I'd supervise the dubbing of my own show and look after the negative cutting.
Now, when you're cutting picture, it's not like cutting picture in a live action where you've got coverage and you've got master shots and you've got different stuff.
No, you're constrained with what you have. By that time, with the Disney stuff, we were probably getting 50 to 60 feet per 11-minute reel extra to cut with. And that gave you a lot more flexibility. You could fine-tune the action, tighten it up. And, again, sometimes the stuff would come in and the retakes wouldn't be coming in and you'd have to get it on the air. So there were things that you couldn't let go through. You'd have to figure out how to cut around them and make it work.
Yeah.
And that stood me in good stead. And so I worked for Rich Harrison for, I started to say that what would never happen now is they promised us 2 years, and they were as good as their word. At the end of 13 weeks, we were finished with Gummy Bears, and we kept getting our checks until the next season rolled around. And it happened to correspond with a time when my mother had several strokes, and I had to take care of her.
So you were on salary, but you were up at her house.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And, I'll never say anything bad about Disney for that, because it allowed me to, stay alive while I was looking after
And you were getting paid 52 weeks.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, as I say, I don't think that would never happen now, but it did then. Anyway, things tapered off there, and then at some point Disney decided to bring their editorial in-house. And I was no longer at Rich Harrison's at that time. I was between projects, and Charlie was still there, and Charlie and Rich were kind of down on Disney for wanting to pull the plug, and
I were ambivalent because you were going to be on staff.
I was literally collecting unemployment, what I was going to do next, and I got a call on my cell phone. I was at a screening at Paramount, and it was Tom Ruzicka from Disney asking if I wanted to go to work directly for Disney. And
you said, let me think about it. Yeah. Okay, I've thought about it.
And what had happened was I had gotten to work with Alan Zaslav on the Gummy Bears and on DuckTales, and Alan and I had a good rapport. Alan was against bringing the editorial inside because he didn't know who he was going to get. They wanted to keep Alan happy. Alan said, well, if you bring Bob in, I'll be happy. And so he intervened, and I got the job. And
so it was Alan Zaslav who you worked with at Rich Harrison's.
Right. And so for the better part of the next 18 years with asides at Fox for working on the abortive first version of what became what we called a Planet Ice. I can't remember what the title of the final released film was. And then I went to a couple other places along the way, but I
went to work for Spielberg and
on Family Dog, and I worked on Happily Ever After for Hyperion for the third season.
But let's crank back. What was Disney? Since you were at Disney in the very beginning, and for the first year and a half, 2 years, you were at Harrison's, and then you went in house. What was the studio Disney Television Animation like back in the halcyon days of the mid-80s?
Well, it was like a family. I mean, they had a poster at the end of the first season where they had little black and white portraits of everybody at the studio, and
it wasn't that huge.
No, there were 48, 50 people on the poster, and some of the longer surviving wags would keep this poster up and then paste Post-its over people's faces as they
the ones that got it.
Yeah. But it was a different atmosphere than every place else I'd worked. You had to get the show on the air. At Disney, you had to get the show on the air, but they had negotiated, because they were Disney, with the networks to not have their license fee curtailed if
they missed an air date.
And so occasionally, not very often, but occasionally we would miss an air date and they put in a repeat. And there was much more. At Disney, I got the sense, at Deke, whatever their licensing fee was, the heads of the studio took 15% off the top, put it in their pockets before any of the money got spent on production.
Right.
At Disney, I always had the sense that the money was up there on the screen. It wasn't. In 10 years, I think we did, first 10 years, something like 1,200 episodes.
That's a lot of cartooning.
Yeah, it's a lot of cartoons. And I did a count once. There were, several other editors on staff, but of that 1,200, I did something between 400 and 600 of the shows, and the other 3 or 4 editors did the rest.
So walk us through, when you're doing an episode, a Disney episode, what was your work routine, work schedule like to get that thing from the time it arrived in your thinking parlor until the time you...
Well, typically what would happen is we'd get the show, we would sync the track.
You were doing picture as well, right?
Picture as well, yeah. Sync the dialogue track. And then mostly I would work with the directors, Art Vitello, Dave Block, Alan Zaslov, and others as well, Joe Horn.
They'd be there with you in the editing bay.
They'd be there in the editing bay until they got comfortable. And then sometimes, even though they wanted to be there, they were trying to get their shows out, and so they couldn't always be there. And then sometimes you just show it to them after you'd cut it. We would cut down the picture. We would cut the sound effects, cut the music, and then go to the dubbing stage with it.
Did Disney also have the 8 and 8 policy of H&B?
No, that had sort of gone. It was there at the very beginning, but the directors were by that time very down on the normal pause thing, and so basically, because we were still working on film, they cut 8 frames down to 4 frames, which allowed us, if we had a miscut or something, we could we wouldn't be right to the frame.
From an editorial perspective, was it better or worse? Did you prefer having the 8 frames to work with, or were the 4 frames adequate?
I preferred the 4 frames because you'd get the same amount of footage and you'd have 8 frames less dead air, so that you were at least working, more to the action.
It was tighter coming in.
Yeah, it was tighter coming in. And it was just, I think there was a better sense of, because it was a new studio, and because they weren't necessarily charting new ground, because most of the people had worked in TV before, but there was a looseness where you could experiment. And so I remember one of the things that, the traditional animation exposure sheet was a 6-foot sheet. Not that it was 6 feet long.
Yellow and long.
But it covered
lined.
6 feet of animation. And when I was at Deke, they had 11 by 17 paper, and the most they could get on it of usable space was a 4.5 foot exposure sheet. And the animators or the timing directors would go crazy because you'd have to account for this half foot, and so they kept asking for, can we change this back to a 6-foot sheet? And the main reason that they had the sheet length that they did was because it would fit on a Xerox machine.
Oh, at Deke.
Yeah. So I remember we negotiated with the Japanese studio, and it was a very interesting education dealing with the Japanese at the time, because they were very...
This was at Disney?
This was at Deke.
Or this was Deke.
And we had a meeting asking if we could go from a 4.5 foot sheet to a 6-foot sheet. And I spent most of the day in a meeting with these people from the Japanese studio, and you'd explain it to them and they would nod, but the Japanese will never make a decision unless everybody agrees. And so they all nodded their heads, and at the end of the day, no, they wouldn't change it. And it had nothing to do with anything except that
one person held out.
Yeah. I had an interesting experience on a similar grounds later on. We were doing Heathcliff at Deke, and they were 11-minute cartoons. And the decision was made to do a 4.5 foot sub-main title, which would allow us another extra 4.5 feet of footage to cut through the show.
Yeah.
So at the end of the season, we had to conform the negatives, because the negatives stayed back in Tokyo, and so we had the titles made up in the title negative, and we shipped it overseas, and we had an editor here conforming all these things. And
when you're conforming it, what are you just making sure all the tracks fit?
Well, he was conforming the work print to make sure that the titles got cut in, because they had just been done in telecine, and making a work print that we could send back so the Japanese could conform the picture negatives. And I said, before you send them back, let me talk to them. So I said, we're going to be sending you the work prints on these things, and you're going to have to cut them to match, because the soundtracks don't match the picture.
Of course, today anymore. It's all digital.
Yeah. So. So they said, oh, okay. So we send the work prints over, and they said, well, what do you want us to do with these? I said, well, as I explained, we want you to... Oh, okay.
They still didn't get it?
Well, did we do anything wrong? No, you didn't do anything wrong, but we cut things. Well, why didn't you tell us you were going to do this? Well, we didn't think it was necessary.
We're telling you now.
It doesn't, it's not... Well, if we didn't do anything wrong, we don't see why we should do this. Well, you understand the picture no longer syncs with the soundtracks. We have to do this to make... They finally got down to, well, this is going to be very expensive. Yeah, I know, but it's got to be done. They finally did it, but it was just...
Who had to swallow the cost? That's the question.
Well, it was, they were going to bill it. It was, but they just, we had to send them a letter to say that they hadn't done anything wrong. And it's just a totally different mindset. You just do it. And
I'm losing face.
Yeah. Anyway, at Disney, we ended up with a 6-foot exposure sheet, or I think it was a 5-foot exposure sheet. But we ended up eliminating the half foot on the sheet. The normal pause went away. There was just I think a better sense of filmmaking, and the people there, although, as I say, many of them have worked in TV, a number of them have gone back. Alan Zaslav went back to being an office boy at Warner's in the 40s, and Fred Wolf had his own animation studio, and it was just a higher level of
competency.
Well, of craft, I think, than had been necessary at some of the other studios.
Yeah.
And so it was back in the beginning of that golden, I don't know if you call it a golden age, but the golden spot of animation where everybody was working and the industry was prospering. And I mean, when I started at Hanna-Barbera in '78,
there was a lot of unemployment.
There wasn't a lot of unemployment because there weren't a lot of people in the business. They were either 20 years old and just out of school, or they were 80 and had been working in the business. And there was because the business had decayed through. There was a whole long period of time where there was nobody coming into the business. So you had people 50 years of age and up, mm-hmm. and people finally in the 70s coming in. Right.
So you had 23-year-olds.
Right. And the only reason we were let in is because
they needed you.
Other people were retiring or dying, and. But that changed over the next few years. The business started booming, but there were no middle-aged people in animation when I started.
I remember. It was the same thing in features.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think it was the same across the industry, and the industry was a lot smaller.
Yeah.
You had 300, 400, 500, 600 people. It wasn't the huge business that it later became.
Mm-hmm. Because especially features. Disney animated features made money. No other studios
made money, and nobody else made them except the occasional special
one shot. Yeah, mm-hmm.
and it just wasn't happening. It was happening in television. What was the Disney TVA studios, the television animation studios? What was it like to work with in that environment at that studio? In the late '80s when you were there.
Well, it was as I say, it was somewhat like a family. We were all working together, and in editorial certainly we were all sharing ideas and.
Did you have a lot of input further up the line, or? Was that pretty much as it was elsewhere?
The other difference, I think, was, it didn't happen very often when you had to talk to the higher-ups. But every once in a while, it was useful. And after Michael Webster left and Gary Kreisel took a more active role in running the studio.
Had Gary been there from the beginning?
He was there from the beginning.
But he wasn't heading it up.
He was heading it up, but he wasn't active in the trenches. But he became so. And, if you needed to talk to Gary, you'd call his office and you'd say, can I get 5 minutes or 10 minutes with Gary? Well, he's got nothing today. Can you do it tomorrow morning at 10:35? Sure. By the time I left, you daren't talk to the executives because they'd fire you on the site for deigning to impinge upon their imperial majesties. And
wasn't as loosey-goosey.
you'd have to make an appointment to show a cut 6 or 8 weeks in advance.
Same thing happened at features.
Yeah. And I remember one day we were having a session in my room, and we were going to be screening for Sharon Morrill and David Stainton at 1:30. So at 1:30, we're all there in my room, and we get a call from Sharon Morrill's office. Is David there yet? No, David's not here yet. Well, call us.
These are the two heads of
right.
TVA. And
Well, David was head of the studio, and Sharon was head of
direct-to-videos. Right.
So Sharon's office said, well, call us when David gets there. So then David's office calls. David's on his way. Okay, so we call Sharon's office. David's on his way. So Sharon comes down, and it takes her, she gets down there, and it takes David 15 minutes to walk the 15 feet from his office to my office. And then we sat there for half an hour while David and Sharon discussed what kind of writing pens they like to write with and what kind of bottled water they like to drink. And you just had to bite your tongue because,
they were the kings.
They were the kings. But, I worked with Spielberg. He didn't work that way. I never had any one-on-one meetings with Jeffrey Katzenberg, but I had several group meetings with him when we were doing Return of Jafar. And, you might only have Jeffrey for 10 minutes or 15 minutes, but while you were there, you had his undivided attention, and he wasn't taking phone calls, and he wasn't,
Contrasted to Mr. Staten and Miss Morrill, what were they doing? Were they taking phone
oftentimes
calls?
they take calls and just, filling the air with irrelevancies when you're trying to get the work done,
Yeah.
And it was, I think the biggest difference was over the course of the years I was at Disney. The first few years, there was an awful lot of product turned out by a relatively constrained number of people, and then
Empire building
took place, and whereas we did Return to Jafar, which was basically the first 4 episodes of the Aladdin TV series, and somebody said, hey, it's got a continuous story, we could turn it into a video. So we cut it for pace, and we, I think, added another 1.5 minutes of animation, and we did a full feature type soundtrack on it. And Jeffrey Katzenberg was very impressed with it for what it was, and I remember him saying, well, we're going to put those 4 episodes on the shelf because we're asking people to pay money for this version, home video. And so we made 4 other episodes to fill out that. But that picture went on to make, my guess is something in the neighborhood of $500 million over the, around the world.
Really?
It was just, 18 months later, I think we had 3 or 4 different wrap parties, and each one was more elaborate than the one before.
For Return to Jafar.
Yeah.
Because it kept rolling out, and I think it made $100-something million in the U.S. market. Mm-hmm. And by the time, and then they play it off on TV after they.
I think finally they have.
But not at the time. And that would have been about, what year would that have been? About the mid-90s? 94, 95, 96?
I don't remember exactly what year it was. I know it was just as
this picture came out about
coming,
93. So
the Avid was coming in, and so we were, one of the things for an old moviola jockey like me was, you could see that the editing was moving into electronics. You knew the future, but by the same token, I took video editing classes forever, but never took a job doing video editing because I was always making more money doing the film. And, it's the dinosaur syndrome. You can see it coming, but, you're sort of hanging on.
You hate to give it up.
Yeah. And again, to Disney's credit, when they brought in the Avids, they trained us all rather than going out and finding people from the outside. And so Return of Jafar was one of the first things
done on the Avid.
Done on the Avid.
How many episodes of the TV series? They did several seasons of that, didn't they?
They did. I think there were 103 or 104 altogether. They did the 65 first year, and they did a second order for the second year of 30-something, and then there were a few more odd episodes to make up for the Return of Jafar thing. And I cut all but 8 of those, I think.
Wow. That's impressive.
And, sometimes you'd have 3 or 4 shows going at the same time, and you'd be, cutting one and sending one off to the negative cutter, and so it could be kind of hairy in terms of scheduling. But the Avid was great and also a curse in some ways, because at the time, Disney, as many of the studios were, was strictly a film studio, and they did not want to have the tape master as their only source. So we had to cut negative to match what we'd cut on the Avid, and now it was easier to snip out frames to
streamline it and fine tune it,
but that's difficult when you're cutting negative, because you've got to you have these 1-frame, 2-frame cuts and things like that. But the one series that I think was, for me, the most interesting challenge was the Gargoyles series. Ellen Orson was assigned as the editor on that. She wasn't particularly fond of the subject matter, the action-adventure stuff. And the show had been pushed ahead. They were going to put out what became Quack Pack.
Which was a whole syndicated package, right?
Well, it was another Donald Duck, mostly focused on the nephews. So in the meantime, they did these 5 pilot episodes for Gargoyles.
Yeah.
They tested them. It went very well. So suddenly they wanted Gargoyles, so Quack Pack was put on the back burner, and they rushed through Gargoyles. Well, the things you learn when you're... Gargoyles had a continuing story arc. Each episode was self-contained, but there was a continuing arc. And because of that continuing arc, they couldn't be aired out of order. And so Ellen was away. I can't remember why now, whether she was sick or whether she was taking a few days vacation. And this episode had come in, and she'd cut it. And it turned out that the retakes weren't going to be in time for the show to get on the air. And so Tom Rosica, who was second in command there at the studio, came down to me and said, "Can you cut this thing overnight so we can air it? Because if you can do that, then the show will go on. If we can't, then the show's going to be canceled." So no pressure.
No pressure, just relax.
So Philip Malamuth, who's one of our assistants there, and I, reconstructed the show because it had already been cut, and recut it, knowing that the retakes weren't going to be in. So if there was a flub in the action, or there was something an overlay didn't, you had to cut around it to make it work. I remember, a character, their leg layer got off, and so the legs disappeared and things like that. So that one, although Disney was mostly a 9-to-5 operation, which is part of why I liked it, that one we pulled an all-nighter, and 9:30 the next morning, the studio heads came in and looked at it, and they said, "Well, okay, we can air this." And so then I became, because Ellen wasn't really that fond of the subject matter, I became the editor for Gargoyles after that.
Oh, well, good for you.
And
that went on for multiple years, didn't it?
No, but it was a full 65. I think there were several episodes that were designed to have spin-offs, and I think they were hoping that it would. But there was at the time it was done, Greg Weisman and Frank Parr and Dennis Woodyard, they were all into action-adventure stuff, and Disney was thinking that they wanted to compete in the action-adventure arena with some of the other studios. Then they decided, no, they didn't really want to do that, so although the show was popular, they could have gone on, but they just didn't. But there was another episode in there, again, because you couldn't show them out of order, and this one was a real no-no, because there was no way to cut the negative. We had a show, had to get on the air, and it was an undersea sea monster submarine show, and I used every trick in the book. I repeated shots. I used parts of shots over and over again. I flopped shots. To fill out the time. And by the time the retakes finally did come in after the show had aired, and we couldn't use any of them because the show was so different than
so the show didn't go on the air?
No, it went on the air, but it was the video master that went on. We could never cut the negative to match what went on the air. There were things that I did that just because there was a Gargoyle show that was really had problems with the overseas animation. We needed more time. The Gargoyles came out at night, so one of the things was the transition from daytime to nighttime, and we had a 3-foot shot where it went from daylight to nighttime, and it was just it went like that, and we needed more footage, so I took freeze frames and made it an 18-foot shot, did a long dissolve from daylight to moonlight. And it was quite effective, I think, in terms of pacing and in terms of the transition. It was more believable than just this instantaneous thing. And if the sound editors at that time, we were using another group of sound editors, if they had played it better, I was hoping to hear traffic and then going
crickets
to the nights and distant traffic, and they didn't quite match my expectations. But
oh well,
I didn't have any say over that at that time.
You were just cutting pictures on that one. You weren't cutting the sound, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And dubbing the sound. So you were at Disney straight through from like 88 until about 98?
Well, let's see, 85, 95, 2003, 2004.
So
but again, there were some interludes in there.
What happened? Now let's talk about the interludes, because one of your interludes was going to work on Brad Bird's, although it wasn't Brad Bird's exactly, Family Dog, and Steven Spielberg, Tim Burton being the executive producers. So when did that take place, and you had to leave Disney to go do it?
I can't remember the exact year, and I'm not sure whether I left Disney or left somewhere else to go do it. I'd have to look that up, and you probably have it there in your handy crib sheet.
Yeah, I think I have it in my handy crib sheet. But you started working on Family Dog.
Yeah, Chuck Richardson, who I first met with you when he was in publicity at Disney, was the producer on that show. And or the working producer, and it was another one where it was a problem show for several reasons. One of the reasons that Hanna-Barbera had devised the normal pause system way back in the early days of TV animation was to know how to budget the length of the show. On Family Dog, there was very little on-screen dialogue, and so in a 2,000-foot show, you might have 200 feet of dialogue, and the rest of it was just storyboarded action.
Yeah.
Some of which was, animated well, and some of which wasn't, and so we had to do a lot of conniving to get the footage to work, and then we had to bring in the actors to ADR or record new voices for to fill out the rest of the footage, and so that was another post-production interesting thing, where adding the sound effects and adding the dialogue really helped the show. Unfortunately, because it had been perceived as a problem show, we did a test dub of the first one, and they liked that well enough to let us do a test dub of the second one. But by the time the third one came around, they decided to wash their hands of it, and they sent the whole series up to Nelvana to finish. And I don't think they ever made the full 13. I think they only made 11 of the 13 on that series. We came that close to getting it approved and moved on. And I think they used our versions of the two shows, but it you have these little disappointments along the way.
Right. And then you left to go over to Fox Features, feature animation. You did Fern Gully. You were an editor on that.
Again, with Chuck Richardson. I was the post-production supervisor on Fern Gully. I wasn't the editor. And that's another learning experience. We got down to toward the end of the production, and we decided, we got to get credits put together. So I gathered as many people's names as I could and jobs and put them on a list, and I circulated the list to the department heads saying, this is not final, and this is for your input. And God almighty, this person doesn't deserve credit on this, they didn't do this.
Screaming and yelling.
I said, don't shoot the messenger, this is why you're here.
Just trying to put it together.
Yeah.
So, but each time you'd go off into the hinterlands to another studio, but you would always return to the bosom of the mouse.
Yeah,
right?
Basically, although I was at Disney for the better part of 18 years, I was, and always on a week-to-week as an editor I was never under contract. I'd work until the project was finished, and then if they had another project, I'd move on to that, and if they didn't, I'd get my
pink slip.
Yes, my Uncle Sam's endowment to the arts, unemployment insurance, and so I would manage to land on both feet, and
but you were there off and on for a quarter of a century.
Well, yeah, something like that.
Until almost 2010. So that's a long time. That's
in the later years it was slower, and I'd actually decided to retire as an editor, but I got called by Warner Brothers to go in and do Tom and Jerry Meet Sherlock Holmes. And
how was that working experience? That was your last direct-to-video feature.
Well, it's again interesting, the difference between the studios. When I did Return of Jafar, we were getting ready to do the credits again. And, and I went to the studio and said, well, this is a long-form show. It was over 60 minutes, and the Editors Guild rules on a long-form show are that the editor gets a full-screen card. And if there is a director of photography and an art director listed up front, the editor gets listed up front. So I went to my boss and said, this is a long form. I'm entitled to a full screen card. And we've never done that. We're not going to do that. I said, well,
It's the contract you signed, dude.
And we're still not going to do it. We don't care what it says. So I said, well, there's nothing personal, but I'll go to the union and file a grievance. And I did, and the studio reluctantly said, well, he's got a point there. It's in the contract.
It's in the contract. We signed this.
And
but
then they said, and because it was an animation, there was no director of photography, there was no art director per se. They said, well, we don't have to put you up front with the other creatives. And no, you don't have to do that. So they're showing the picture at the studio, and the upfront credits come, the show goes on, the end credit crawl goes up, and we're down to the area where there's all these 3 names across and all these Japanese animators, and then suddenly there's a black space and my name rolls up, filling the full
single
screen.
Card.
And there was a cheer in the screening room. And if anybody bothered to watch the credits to the end, my name was much more prominently displayed than it would have been if it had been seen up front. But so Disney got snookered. But the difference was at Warner Brothers and Disney, they never put credits on the boxes for the DVDs.
Right.
Nobody got credit. Warner's, it was just the opposite. You didn't even have to ask. The credits were there on the box. They had a credit block just like they would on a feature film. It was just a different way of approaching things, I mean, I think every studio has its own personality, and it doesn't stay the same because personnel changes, but there's certain established things that keep on because the department heads are fairly consistent through the years at different places, and so it was a good way to go out because it was you didn't have to fight for just the basic respect.
So you got your credit without having to go to the union.
Yeah.
On Warner Brothers. So let's wrap it up with, you've worked at a lot of studios. I'd like to just get your sort of impression of each of the ones that you worked at, which would be starting with
Hanna-Barbera. Hanna-Barbera was a factory, but we were all in it together. I mean, everybody was on the same team and on the same playing field. There wasn't this great...
But the directors didn't come down to supervise you guys?
No, they would come down to look at it before it went out and to bless it, but they didn't sit over our shoulders because, as I say, when we started, we weren't doing the kind of fine cutting that I was doing later.
Did they do more of that at Disney, where the directors would be down in the trenches with you if they could?
At least at first, were always down in the room. And I'll work either way. I mean, I like the collaborative process. I like the discussion of, trying out different ideas and things like that. Ruby Spears was... I don't know that I was there long enough to get a strong impression, but it was very much like Hanna-Barbera because Ken and Joe had
come from there.
It was probably a little less personable. They were a little more aloof. Deke was...
Get it done yesterday?
Well, I always thought Deke was a huge missed opportunity, because at the time they started expanding with Inspector Gadget and with some of the other shows they were doing. They were actually doing better animation than many of the other studios, and they were poised to do great things. But Deke was... They were always basically, except for Inspector Gadget, they were always a producer for hire. They were never originating their own projects as much as they tried, and so they just never...
Do it cheap, get it out.
Do it cheap, get it out, and you know, and they didn't really care how they worked you to death, because basically the heads of the studio, you'd throw a script into the hopper, and 12 weeks later a movie would come out, and they didn't know and they didn't care how it came out, but it better come out. Or I remember Andy Hayward was so proud of himself because he was getting free music from Chaim Saban and Shuki Levy, and I remember him coming back to the studio one day just livid when he finally realized what this free music was costing him, because Chaim was maintaining the sync rights and the publishing and making a fortune on it.
Yeah. The basis of his fortune today.
Right. Mm-hmm. And, you know, Chaim, I mean, it's just, it does my heart proud to see his name over all these, you know, charitable institutions around town. He's really...
Spread the money around.
But I remember one day it was typical Deke type of thing. We were dubbing a number of shows in Canada. Deke was trying to get Canadian tax credits for films, and sometimes they could get them and sometimes they couldn't. At one point we were requested to hire only actors, Canadian actors who were not members of SAG, to do voices for the cartoons, on the hope that even though we were recording them here, that they would qualify for a Canadian tax credit. Didn't work, but you would think it would be a limited talent pool. It wasn't. There were a lot of Canadians
down here,
non-SAG. They just weren't very good.
Which explains why they were non-SAG.
But we had dubbed one of the Heathcliff shows up in Canada. I was sitting in my office, and the show had come back, and some of my other compatriots were watching the show across the hall, and I heard Heathcliff singing Shortened Bread. And I got up from my desk and went across the hall, and I said, roll that back. And they rolled it back and played it, and I said, what's that? And, well, it's Heathcliff singing Shortening Bread. I said, I know that, but did anybody clear that? Oh, it's an old American folk song. We don't have to clear it. I said, like hell it is. It was written in 1928. Now, only I would know this, but obviously in that studio. But we actually had a guy that all of those kind of music decisions were supposed to go through, and they hadn't bothered to ask him.
Because they thought it was PD.
Yeah.
And it wasn't PD.
And so I said, well, we can't let this get on the air. And we called the Sam Fox agency and found out that Shortening Bread was now owned by Fred Waring's Shawnee Music. And we called them, and they were willing to license it to us for, 5 years for $700 or 7 years for $500. I can't remember now. And Andy didn't want to pay it. And he said, well, nobody's ever going to notice. Well, of course, now that we've tipped their hand to it, maybe they'll notice. But,
so
$500 or $50,000 in a lawsuit.
What was the upshot?
They finally paid it. But Deke was just like that. We had a lot of very dedicated and professional people in the service of people who just plain didn't care. They wanted to get it out and get their money and go on to the next.
Right.
And
how long were you at Deke? 2 years?
About 18 months.
18 months, year and a half?
Disney, as I said earlier, the money actually ended up on the screen, and
now, that's what I want to ask you about Disney. How did it evolve? When you first got there was 50 people, 45 people, and it had a whole different atmosphere. You could you could talk to different higher ups.
Well, I think, it's just as with anything, the growth, part of it was necessary because we were doing more shows and they were more elaborate. Part of it was just evolutionary. People were getting burned out and they needed additional help. I don't think it, as so many of these things, I don't think it was intended that it was going to become this top-heavy bureaucracy, but it eventually became that.
It's almost inevitable.
I think it's human nature. And so where you had maybe 200 to 250 people turning out the first 1,100 hours or half hours, you probably had 500 people turning out the next 600 hours, and so maybe not quite that drastic, but along those lines.
Another 60-70%.
Yeah. Ruby Spears, I said, it was.
You weren't there long enough.
Hyperion was very pleasant. It was. I was only there for the one season of a show that had already been established.
What was that show?
Happily Ever After.
Oh yeah.
It was
fairy tale kind of a deal.
Fairy tales, but with minority characters. Rainbow casting for the stories. So in The Snow Queen, for example, Eartha Kitt played the Snow Queen and was the voice of the Snow Queen. And that was fun. It was again because it was a very small studio, and essentially I was my own assistant on that. So we just ground it out, and it was
just did it.
And Warner Brothers, as I say, was just it was more. Warner Brothers was more like, at least in the short time I was there on Tom and Jerry, Meet Sherlock Holmes, it was more like the early days at Hanna-Barbera. It was looser. It was.
You did your job and everybody else did theirs.
Mm-hmm. It wasn't top heavy with executives.
That's still pretty much true of Warner Brothers.
And Warner's is just a little more loose. I remember, Warner's had done, and this was when the Spielberg cartoon show, with the little
Tiny Toons,
yeah. They had done some parody of a Disney character, and it was all through the show, and we were doing a Darkwing Duck at Disney, and somebody did a parody of Batman. In literally 30 seconds, it was just a funny little throwaway gag, and the Disney attorneys just went berserk. They couldn't allow this to get on the air, and we had to cut it out. And,
we'll be sued by.
Yeah,
DC
well, and I think
Warner Brothers.
I'm sure their fear was
that's
less.
Their mindset. So
I'm sure their fear was less that they were going to be sued, and that it might start some kind of back and forth escalation in parody, and also because they do sue, they thought that Warner's might sue them. It was so there was always, although. It wasn't censorship so much, but there was always a bit of constraint at Disney in terms of the scripting. It never got as outlandish and as fun as it might have. But
it has to be vetted by the attorneys.
Yeah, well, and I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I understand. It's just
saves money down the road.
Yeah, so basically, I always looked on my career in animation, like working on B pictures in the 30s. You were turning out pictures for a price. They were set for a certain market. They were, and you did the best you could. And
with material at hand.
Yeah, and I think overall we turned out a lot of good stuff.
Yeah.
And worked with a lot of creative people. I always used to. Disney executives at one point went on a retreat to learn how to work together. And part of the exercise...
This is in the 90s?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Part of the exercise was they were given found materials to make a bridge model. And come Monday morning after this retreat, here's this bridge on display. And I'm not saying it wasn't a worthy exercise, but this was, not top of the
line bridge.
And I was thinking, it's something of an embarrassment. You've got the greatest artists in the world working here, and you're sort of, putting this out there as if it's worthy of their consideration. And I always thought there was a little bit of the. I remember one of the executives at Disney telling me once, she didn't know how animation was made, and she didn't want to know, because if she knew, then she couldn't demand that it be done when it was impossible to do it.
Great.
And
ignorance is bliss.
Yeah, I think that's probably the thing that's changed the most, is that the people that worked in the business, because we came up with all these people who'd been there almost from the beginning, because of the downturn in the business in the 50s and 60s. They knew everything about the process, and now a lot of the executives know nothing about the process. And not only do they not want to know, they don't even really care about animation. Oftentimes, they're more interested in using it as a stepping stone to get into live action, which is why they want to hire all these name voices so they can build relationships. And I'm probably being more cynical than I should for public consumption, but I'm retired, so what the hell?
It's called progress.
Yeah. But it's you're making it's honest work. You're making pictures for a select segment of the audience, and I think it worked for that segment, because today when I mentioned somebody I worked with, everybody goes, "Oh, I watched that when I was growing up."
That's right.
It's
you're now entertaining the second and third generation that have seen your work, your editorial work. Well, thank you very much, Robert.
My pleasure.
It's been informative and a pleasure, and we'll get this up on the blog.
Okay.